Tomiwa Owolade claims that Irish, Jewish and traveller people all suffer from racism. They undoubtedly experience prejudice. This is similar to racism, and the two words are often used as if they are interchangeable. Our correspondent continues. It is true that many types of white people with points of difference, such as redheads, can experience this prejudice, but they are not all their lives subject to racism. The letter concludes, in pre-civil rights America, Irish people, Jewish people and travellers were not required to sit at the back of the bus. In apartheid South Africa, these groups were allowed to vote. And at the height of slavery, there were no white-seeming people manacled on the slave ships. Right, so a lot to unpick, not least that seeming comparison between people picking on redheads and anti-Semitism. What about the idea that white-seeming people, whatever that means, cannot be the victims of racism? And yet, absolutely no mention of the Holocaust whilst referencing anti-Jewish sentiment. Not indeed the fact that the study quoted in the article showed travellers and Jewish people experience the greatest levels of racism in the UK. And so, who was responsible? Former Shadow Home Secretary and lifelong anti-racism campaigner Labour's Diane Abbott, herself black of course. Despite an inevitable apology, given Labour's relationship with anti-Semitism, Keir Starmer has chosen to suspend her from the party, and her future in politics hangs in the balance.
There's an investigation going on at the moment. That's the right thing. The whip has been suspended. That was done very, very swiftly, and I have condemned what she said, along with many other people.
But does Ms Abbott have a point, or at least something close to one? Is the hierarchy of racism of which Keir Starmer complains, in fact, a reality? I'm Niall Paterson, and this is the Sky News Daily. Today, I'm joined by Tomiwa Owolade, a writer and the author of the original Observer article to which Diane Abbott was responding. Tomiwa, great to have you on. I suppose we need to start with Diane Abbott herself. When you read her letter, her response to your article, what were your first thoughts?
My first thoughts were a mixture of both surprise and unsurprise. So I was surprised that she was willing to very publicly express those views. I would understand if she expressed them through a Facebook comment or like a tweet, something that was throwaway. But the fact that she would express such views through a letter sent to a national newspaper surprised me. But I was also unsurprised because she was merely articulating the logical conclusion of a set of what I would consider pseudo-progressive assumptions about racism, which is that racism is only about prejudice and power. Racism only affects so-called people of color and doesn't affect ethnic minority people that are perceived as white. So yeah, it was a mixture of both surprise but also non-surprise.
We'll delve into Diane Abbott's rationale for what little there may well be in just a second. But just remind us, the article to which she was responding, what was the central thrust of it? The headline is in front of it at the moment. Racism in Britain is not a black and white issue. It's far more complicated.
Yes, so the initial Observer article that I wrote the week before Diane Abbott's letter was about trying to explain that racism is not something that merely affects black and brown people. Racism also affects Jewish people in the UK, Irish communities in the UK, and also traveller and Roma communities in the UK. So we need to be more nuanced in how we understand racism. And this was on the back of a very long and comprehensive report that was recently released that found that the ethnic minority groups that are most likely to report experiencing racial abuse in the UK are traveller communities and Jewish people.
The report Tomiwa is referencing is the Evidence for Equality National Survey conducted by researchers at Oxford, Glasgow and Manchester. It claims to have the most up-to-date and detailed evidence on ethnic inequalities in the UK. including what its authors say is unprecedented insight into the experiences of Gypsy, traveller, Roma and Jewish people who reported the highest levels of abuse. Now, Tomiwa, another thing that I found pretty interesting about the study was the difference in reported experiences of racism between minority groups that are often, clearly wrongly, assumed to have similar experiences. Take, for example, almost half of Black Caribbean Brits reporting having experienced some sort of racist assault, but just over a third of Black African Brits reporting the same.
And I think that might partly be the fact that what Black Caribbean people consider racism might be different to what Black African people consider racism as well. That might be part of the story. We don't know yet. The report hasn't sufficiently delved into that difference. And I think even more generally speaking, what is striking is that Black Caribbean people have a very different experience of things like education in the UK to Black African people. So Black Caribbean students in British schools, for example, are more than twice as likely to be excluded from schools than Black African pupils. And Black African pupils tend to have a greater GCSE and A-level attainment at schools as well. So if we look at the institutions within our society, the experiences of even what we often refer to as the Black community, there are differences within that community which I think needs to be acknowledged if we genuinely care about the inequalities in our society.
Let's focus on the central complaint that people had with Diane Abbott's letter, which is this idea that white people cannot be the victims of racism from her perspective. And I suppose the immediate counter to that is that 60% of the traveller population, 55% of Jewish people have indeed experienced racism and are at the top of the league table, so to speak, that is in this research. Does that not suggest, however, then, that hierarchy of racism that Keir Starmer talked about might actually exist, that there are groups who experience more racism? It's just not the way round that Diane Abbott assumes it to be.
Yeah, but with terms like hierarchy of racism, I think we need to be careful because there is a risk in viewing racism as a sort of competition. There's a risk in viewing racism in that way because that might encourage certain ethnic minority groups to feel a degree of envy, essentially, that some minority groups are getting more media attention, that some minority groups are getting a greater degree of sympathy. And I think that any form of racism, as I said earlier, deserves to be both condemned, but also to be challenged. And we as a collective civil society, we need to challenge racism as comprehensively as possible. But I think viewing it as this sort of hierarchy, I think that's potentially dangerous because racism is not a competition. The fact that some ethnic minority groups might experience more racism, possibly, that might be factually true, but that doesn't mean that other ethnic minority groups are less deserving of anti-racist attention. But I think what Diane Abbott objected to more than the figures or the statistics is the fact that I essentially included minority groups perceived to be white as victims of racism, understandably but erroneously claimed that Diane Abbott has said that Jewish people and other ethnic minority groups experience less racism than Black and brown people. That's not what she said. She said Jewish people, traveller communities, and Irish groups cannot be victims of racism.
Tomiwa, I wonder what role the concept of white privilege might have played in bringing Diane Abbott to write the letter. But is that perhaps what spurred Diane Abbott into action? The idea that just by nature of my birth, as a white man, the white man in this conversation, I enjoy privileges that people who do not share my skin tone do not. Is that what has pushed Diane Abbott into this conclusion?
Yes, I think the position that Diane Abbott eventually expressed in that letter is a direct logical conclusion of a very sort of simplistic idea of white privilege, because if we accept that white privilege actually exists, and if we accept that Jewish people or Irish people or traveller communities, all of them are white, if we accept that, then by definition, those groups are in some sense privileged. Those groups cannot be victims of racism by definition. And I think this is both patently untrue because traveler communities, for example, have the worst educational outcomes out of all ethnic minority groups in the UK. And the notion of white privilege, of course, is underpinned by the idea that white people are privileged in terms of like education, employment, and so forth. It's not just inaccurate, but it's also dangerous as well, because one of the key tropes of anti-Semitism is the idea that Jewish people exercise disproportionate power over the rest of society. And if Jewish people are white, then ultimately the conclusion that must be drawn is that Jewish people are in some sense privileged. And that segues very conveniently to the perception by anti-Semites that Jewish people exercise power in society.
Tomiwa, do you think that in writing that letter, Diane Abbott was herself racist? Do you think that she holds what we could classify as racist views? You know, Diane Abbott, as has been reported often over the past few days, lifelong anti-racism campaigner, I mean, herself might fall into that category.
I think I would incline more towards the view expressed by the author and comedian David Baddiel, the author of the book Jews Don't Count. And Baddiel recently argued that with Diane Abbott, it's not a straightforward case of racism. It's more of a case of a ethical blind spot to certain forms of prejudice. And what Baddiel had in mind in particular is anti-Semitism. So it's not a very straightforward case of Diane Abbott being an anti-Semite. It's more of a case of her not viewing anti-Semitism as something which is racist, which is a grave moral failing in its own right, essentially. And I think what was also striking about the letter was the fact that she used as examples to illustrate her points apartheid South Africa and Jim Crow America in response to my column, which was specifically about racism in the UK. So I think another part of the story is the way in which a very American-centric conception of racism is now seen as the main way, or even the only way, with which we can understand racism.
Well, that, of course, is what you explored in your book, This Is Not America, the idea that, you know, US ideas about racism have really shaped the way in which we think about the issue here. What is the negative impact of wholesale importing this view of racism from the United States?
It makes us unable to specifically focus on the inequalities that affect our society. So if we can't properly understand the inequalities in British society, then we can't change it. And it also means that we can't also look at the differences and nuances within the Black community in the UK. In fact, I wouldn't even use a term like Black community. I prefer Black communities. For instance, just one example. The majority of Black Americans are descended from enslaved Africans that were brought over from Africa to the New World between the 17th and the 19th centuries, whereas the majority of Black people in the UK are either African immigrants or the children of African immigrants. Many people still think that the majority of Black people in the UK are Black Caribbean people, but that's not true. Over the past 20, 25 years, there's been a huge influx of migration from Africa, which has completely transformed the demographic makeup of Black British people. But this fascinating story hasn't been reported sufficiently. So I think my book and a lot of the things I write about is about trying to specifically address what's going on in the UK when it comes to race relations, because I think it's not only important to do that, to have a more nuanced and a more truthful anti-racist politics, but I also think doing that gives a greater degree of dignity to every black and ethnic minority person, and also to every white person as well, by looking at our own culture, history, and politics, judging that and looking at it through our own terms rather than through the perspective of a foreign country.
Tomiwa, I think we certainly both do agree that black community as a phrase is unnecessarily reductive. I think you could probably argue black communities as well. Again, it doesn't give the full picture of the diversity and the difference. But I wonder, when I say the sentence, Britain is a racist country, to you, do you identify that as valid, as true, or again, perhaps unnecessarily reductive?
I would ask, could you be more specific?
Yeah, that's the problem with that phrase, isn't it? It's a statement of fact, but without any detail.
Because if you say that statement as well, then there's a risk in that statement turning into a kind of banality, because then you could say, well, isn't that true of all countries in the world? Is there a country in the world that's not racist? So that's why I would ask, what do you mean specifically? And I think one of the problems with this entire discussion or discourse on race is the lack of specificity and the utter reliance upon generalizations, because then we can't have a fruitful conversation unless we are specific in what we're talking about, because then we're just talking at cross purposes.
Let's conclude with where we started with Diane Abbott herself. And of course, she has made a very public apology. She has been suspended from the party, and there will be an investigation. What ultimately would you like to see happen as a conclusion to this?
Well, personally speaking, if Diane Abbott could show genuine contrition, and by that I mean explaining why she wrote what she wrote and why she's now changed her mind, then the Christian values of forgiveness and mercy with which I was raised would incline me towards readmitting her to the Labour Party. But I also think that this is both a morally and politically difficult thing for Keir Starmer to do, because Keir Starmer has recently outlined a zero-tolerance approach to antisemitism, and Keir Starmer is now trying to, rightly so, utterly distance himself from the Labour Party. And I also think, realistically, Abbott would not be able to offer that kind of substantial apology. So I think, realistically now, Starmer has no option other than to expel Diane Abbott, which I think is a very sad outcome, because I have no personal animus or ill will towards Diane Abbott. But what she said, especially after Starmer has outlined a zero-tolerance approach to antisemitism, what Abbott said was totally unacceptable.
Tomiwa Owolade, great to have you on the Daily Podcast. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
My thanks to Tomiwa Owolade, and of course to you for listening to the Sky News Daily with me, Niall Paterson. This edition was produced by Rosie Gillett with Alex Eden. Our editor is Philly Beaumont.